There were 3 keys in the apartment. The problem became impossible to ignore the moment Evan and Daniel realized they had been given only 2, and neither of them could remember a time when the third had ever entered their lives. The worst part was not the discrepancy. The worst part was the shared, unspoken certainty: if the key existed, then it had already been waiting. And it was not going to disappear until it was used. Evan Mercer became aware of this late on a Tuesday night, standing alone in the hallway of their apartment in Fall River. He had opened the fuse box out of habit, not concern, a motion he had performed countless times since they moved in. The metal panel hung slightly ajar, open just enough to feel intentional. Inside, taped neatly to the inner wall, was a key. It was heavier than he expected when he peeled it away from the metal. Not rusted. Not broken. Simply old. The teeth were uneven, subtly asymmetrical, as if shaped by hand rather than machine. There was no label, no mark, nothing to suggest where it belonged. Evan stood there longer than necessary, unsettled less by the object itself than by the certainty that it had not been there before. He was meticulous in ways that bordered on rigid. He noticed changes. He remembered details. The key violated that internal order without making a sound. The apartment around him was newly renovated, stripped of character and intention. Neutral walls. Clean lines. A place designed to feel temporary even if occupied for years. Evan and Daniel Holt had chosen it deliberately. They wanted a space that asked nothing of them. Somewhere that carried no history they would have to acknowledge. They had moved in at the beginning of autumn, when the air still carried warmth but no longer trusted it. The landlord had handed them 2 keys, freshly cut, clearly labeled, and nothing more. No spare. No warning. No stories about previous tenants. For 3 weeks, the apartment behaved exactly as expected. That, Evan would later realize, was the first sign something was wrong. He placed the key on the kitchen counter and waited for Daniel to come home. When Daniel saw it, his reaction was casual enough to feel practiced. He assumed it was a leftover from renovation, something forgotten behind drywall or wiring. He suggested taping it back where it had been found and letting the landlord deal with it. Evan agreed without argument. Outwardly, the explanation made sense. Internally, something resisted. The key did not feel forgotten. It felt patient. That night, Evan left it on the counter where it could not be missed. He did not hide it. He did not lock it away. He wanted proof that it followed the same rules as everything else in the apartment. That it would still be there in the morning. When he woke, it was gone. The counter was clean. Unchanged. No sign that anything had been moved or disturbed. Daniel assumed Evan had put it back without remembering. Evan assumed Daniel was mistaken. Neither of them said this out loud. Over the next 2 days, small inconsistencies began to surface. The hallway light was on when neither remembered turning it on. The fuse box stood open again, then closed, then open once more. Evan found himself pausing at the end of the hallway, staring at a blank stretch of wall he could not stop noticing, though he could not explain why. Daniel began waking up exhausted. Not anxious. Not restless. Simply drained, as if his sleep had been interrupted without his awareness. He moved through the apartment with a faint hesitation, occasionally stopping as if listening for something that never arrived. When Evan asked if anything felt wrong, Daniel shook his head, but without conviction. On the 3rd night, Evan woke to the sound of movement. Not hurried. Not clumsy. Bare feet against hardwood, slow and deliberate. He sat up and saw Daniel standing at the end of the hallway, posture relaxed, eyes open but unfocused. In Daniel's hand was the key. He held it loosely, without tension, as if it belonged there. As if it always had. Daniel did not respond when Evan said his name. He did not turn. After a moment that stretched too long to measure, he stepped closer to the blank section of wall Evan had been staring at for days. He lifted the key slightly. And stopped. He stood there, motionless, until Evan reached him and gently guided him back toward the bedroom. Daniel followed without resistance. When he woke the next morning, he remembered none of it. The key was gone again. By then, Evan understood something that unsettled him more than fear ever could. The apartment was not reacting to them. It was remembering something they had already decided not to. And whatever the key belonged to had not finished waiting. Evan did not decide to leave the apartment. The decision formed somewhere beneath thought, assembling itself quietly while he stood alone in the kitchen, staring at the empty place on the counter where the key should have been. By morning, the space felt compromised. Not hostile. Not dangerous. Simply no longer neutral. The walls carried the faint pressure of something unfinished, like a sentence that had been interrupted and was waiting to resume. Daniel insisted he felt fine. He said it easily, too easily, as if the words had been rehearsed before meaning was attached to them. He remembered nothing of the night Evan had witnessed, no hallway, no key, no blank section of wall. He only knew he was tired, and that the apartment felt off in a way he couldn't define without sounding unreasonable. That was when Evan stopped asking questions inside the apartment. He drove east without putting the destination into his phone. The address surfaced anyway, complete and precise, as if it had been stored somewhere long before he needed it. Streets narrowed. Traffic thinned. The familiar structure of the city gave way to something older, quieter, less willing to explain itself. By the time he reached Salem, Evan felt as though he had not arrived so much as been permitted. The house stood on a narrow street that discouraged lingering. 2 stories. Dark wood nearly black with age and rain. Tall, narrow windows that reflected nothing clearly. There were no symbols, no decorations meant to suggest belief or invitation. Only a small hand-painted sign beside the door. Rowan Graves. Private readings. Inside, the air was still and dry, carrying the muted scent of old paper and wood. The room was modest in size, painted a shade of gray deep enough to absorb light rather than reflect it. A single desk lamp illuminated a scarred wooden table covered with a dark cloth. No music played. No clocks ticked. The silence felt deliberate. Rowan Graves was already seated. He did not look up when Evan entered. He did not ask for a name. He did not gesture for Evan to sit. The absence of ceremony was disarming in a way no performance could have been. It felt less like a meeting and more like a continuation. Evan spoke because stopping felt impossible. He described the apartment, the third key, the way it appeared and vanished without explanation. He spoke of Daniel standing in the hallway, awake but unreachable, holding an object he could not remember owning. Evan did not exaggerate. He did not ask whether any of it was possible. He stated the facts as they had occurred, careful not to shape them into something easier to hear. Rowan Graves listened without interruption. When Evan finished, Rowan reached for the deck of cards resting near his hands. The cards were old, their edges softened by years of use. He did not shuffle theatrically. The movement was slow, economical, as if the outcome did not require persuasion. 5 cards were laid out in silence. The first card reflected the present state. Rowan indicated that it did not show intrusion or threat. It showed activation. Something that had been dormant had resumed function. According to the card, nothing new had entered Evan's life. Something old had been recalled. The second card revealed the severed connection. Not between people, but between acknowledgement and consequence. Rowan stated that this was not a loss. It was a deliberate suspension. A decision made earlier than Evan wanted to remember. The third card marked the moment of distortion. Rowan did not describe it as a mistake. He described it as a choice framed as practicality. According to the spread, this was where sequence had been interrupted, not erased, only delayed. The fourth card explained the symbol. Rowan finally spoke of the key. He stated that the key was not an object meant to open a door. It was an indicator. Proof that something had been sealed without resolution. According to the structure revealed by the cards, the apartment had not created the problem. It had been selected because it could hold it. The final card was the condition. Rowan did not call it a solution. He stated, without emphasis, that the key should not be used. Not because it was dangerous, but because using it would finalize what had been left incomplete. As long as it remained unused, sequence could still be interrupted. Evan asked the only question that mattered. What happens if it's already been used? Rowan did not answer directly. He gathered the cards slowly, returning them to the cloth. Then he said only this, that structures which remember do not announce when they begin correcting themselves. They simply proceed, until alignment is restored. Evan left the house carrying no instructions, no ritual, no reassurance. But he understood something clearly for the first time since the key appeared. The apartment was not asking whether they were ready. It was determining whether they were willing. The apartment felt different the moment Evan returned. Nothing was out of place. No furniture moved. No doors left open. The air smelled the same, clean, neutral, recently lived in. And yet the space no longer behaved like something passive. It felt attentive, as if it had registered Evan's absence and adjusted accordingly. Daniel was sitting at the kitchen table when Evan came in, scrolling through his phone without focus. He looked up, smiled briefly, then looked away again. The exchange passed without comment, but the silence that followed settled too quickly, too neatly, as though it had been prepared in advance. Evan did not mention Salem. He did not mention Rowan Graves. Some things, he sensed, could not be spoken inside these walls without consequence. That evening passed without incident. They cooked. They ate. They discussed ordinary things, work deadlines, errands, the weather shifting along the coast. The conversation never quite connected, each sentence arriving intact and leaving without residue. It felt rehearsed, not by intent, but by necessity. Later, as Evan washed the dishes, he noticed Daniel standing at the end of the hallway. Not moving. Not listening. Just standing, eyes fixed on the same blank stretch of wall that had been drawing Evan's attention for days. "Daniel," Evan said quietly. Daniel blinked, as if the sound had reached him from a distance. He frowned slightly, then shook his head. "Do you remember when this hallway ended?" he asked. The question landed without warning. Evan followed his gaze. The wall was plain, uninterrupted, painted the same muted color as the rest of the apartment. There was nothing there to justify the unease that rose immediately in Evan's chest. "It's always been like that," Evan said. Daniel nodded, but the gesture lacked conviction. "That's what I thought," he said. Then he turned and went back to the living room, the moment already retreating into something unexamined. The door appeared the next morning. Evan noticed it first because his body reacted before his mind did. He stopped short in the hallway, a jolt of disorientation tightening his chest as his eyes struggled to reconcile what they were seeing with what they remembered. Where the blank wall had been was now a narrow wooden door. It was subtle in the way lies often are, painted the same neutral color as the surrounding walls, its frame flush, its edges clean. There was no handle. No hinges visible from this side. Only a small, dark keyhole set at a height that felt deliberate. The door did not announce itself. It behaved as though it had always been there. Evan stood frozen, waiting for the apartment to correct itself. For the door to dissolve back into drywall and paint. It did not. When Daniel came down the hallway, his reaction was immediate, and unsettling in its absence of surprise. He stopped in front of the door and exhaled softly, as if recognizing a long-delayed arrival. "There it is," he said. Evan turned to him sharply. "There what is?" Daniel did not answer right away. He studied the door with a quiet focus, head slightly tilted, as though listening for something just beyond it. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm. "I couldn't remember what it looked like," he said. "Just that it hadn't gone anywhere." Evan felt the words settle into him with slow, sinking weight. Over the course of the day, the apartment began to misbehave. Time fractured in small, deniable ways. Evan checked his watch and found entire hours missing, moments he could not account for but could not definitively prove had vanished. Conversations restarted halfway through. Questions were answered twice. Daniel insisted he had already done things Evan had watched him begin but never finish. The door remained closed. At night, Evan dreamed of standing in front of it, aware that something inside depended on whether it stayed sealed. In the dreams, the key was always present, not in his hand, but close enough to feel. A weight in his pocket. A pressure against his ribs. He never used it. Daniel's sleep worsened. He woke exhausted, his movements slower, his attention drifting at odd moments toward the hallway. Once, Evan found him standing inches from the door, his hand hovering near the keyhole without touching it. "I don't think it's locked," Daniel said quietly. Evan remembered Rowan's words too clearly to argue. The silence that followed that statement stretched longer than it should have. On the fourth night, Evan woke just before dawn to a stillness so complete it felt intentional. No traffic outside. No hum of distant appliances. Even the apartment's usual settling noises had ceased, as if sound itself were being held in place. He sat up, heart already racing. The hallway light was on. Evan stepped out of the bedroom and froze. The door stood open. There was no sound to mark the change. No creak of hinges. No evidence of force. The space beyond the threshold was dark, unfinished, its edges dissolving into shadow. The air spilling from it carried a faint, stale coolness that did not belong to the apartment. Daniel stood beside the doorway, fully awake. He did not look frightened. He looked relieved. And in that moment, Evan understood something with a clarity that left no room for denial. Whatever the door led to had not been created overnight. It had been waiting. And the apartment had finally decided it was time to remember. Evan did not step forward immediately. The open doorway altered the hallway without changing its shape, as if space itself had been edited rather than expanded. The edges of the frame were clean, deliberate, too precise to feel accidental. Beyond it lay a small room, unfinished, dim, stripped of the careful neutrality that defined the rest of the apartment. The renovation had stopped at the threshold. The walls inside were bare studs and aged plaster, uneven and unpainted. The floorboards were old, darker than the rest of the apartment, worn smooth by use that had not been recent enough to remember, but not distant enough to forget. The air carried a faint, stale coolness, like something long sealed but not abandoned. Daniel stepped inside first. He did not hesitate. He did not ask whether he should. The moment his foot crossed the threshold, his posture changed, not dramatically, not emotionally, but completely. The constant tension Evan had begun to notice in him dissolved, replaced by a stillness that felt disturbingly appropriate. Evan followed. The room was small. Intimate in a way that suggested it had never been meant for comfort. Along one wall sat a narrow shelf holding objects arranged with quiet care, as though someone had known they would be returned to eventually. Evan recognized them immediately. A phone, older, its screen dark, the casing scuffed along one edge. He remembered the argument about destroying it. The agreement that it would never be used again. He had believed that agreement had been honored. Beside it lay a jacket, folded neatly. Daniel had claimed he'd donated it years ago. Evan remembered watching him place it in a bag, remembered not questioning where the bag had gone. There was a folder as well, thin and unmarked. Inside were papers Evan recognized by texture before he registered the words. A signature sat at the bottom of the final page. His signature. He remembered signing it. He remembered being told not to read it closely because the outcome had already been decided. He remembered agreeing that it was easier that way. The room was not a hiding place. It was a record. Daniel picked up the jacket slowly, his hand steady. When he spoke, his voice lacked surprise. "I wondered where this went," he said. Evan felt a pressure settle behind his eyes, not fear, not guilt, but recognition. The kind that arrives too late to prevent anything, only to clarify what has already occurred. This was not evidence of wrongdoing. It was evidence of continuity. The room had not been built to conceal a crime. It had been built to preserve a moment, one where a decision had been made jointly, quietly, and then set aside as if agreement alone could neutralize consequence. Evan understood then what Rowan had meant. The key had never been meant to open a door. The door had never been meant to reveal something new. It existed to prevent forgetting. Daniel turned to him, expression unreadable but calm. "We said this was finished," he said, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact. "We said we didn't need to carry it forward." Evan nodded slowly. "We said that," he agreed. The room offered no response. It did not judge. It did not react. It simply held the truth in place, untouched by intention or regret. Behind them, the hallway remained unchanged. The apartment beyond continued to function, unaware or unconcerned. But something fundamental had shifted. The decision they had sealed had not disappeared. It had only been postponed. And now that it had been remembered, Evan understood something with painful clarity. Whatever came next would not be negotiated. It would be aligned. The apartment did not change immediately. That was what unsettled Evan the most. After the door opened, after the room revealed what had been sealed, he expected some visible reaction, lights flickering, walls shifting, something to acknowledge that the boundary between before and after had been crossed. Nothing happened. The hallway looked the same. The kitchen clock continued counting time with indifferent precision. Outside, traffic moved along the street as it always had. The world remained intact. Only the orientation was different. Daniel moved through the apartment with a steadiness Evan had not seen in weeks. The exhaustion that had clung to him dissolved, replaced by something quieter and more resolved. He lingered less. Hesitated less. When he stood in the hallway now, it was not with confusion, but with familiarity, as if the space had finally begun behaving correctly. Evan, by contrast, felt displaced. Not pushed out. Not rejected. Simply misaligned. The apartment no longer responded to him in the same way. Rooms felt subtly resistant, as though his presence required more effort than before. He found himself pausing in doorways, uncertain which direction he had intended to go. The sealed room remained open. Neither of them spoke about it directly. They did not argue. They did not revisit the details of what had been preserved there. The decision they had made years ago did not need restating. It had already asserted itself without explanation. Instead, the consequences expressed themselves through absence. Daniel began spending less time at home, though he never announced where he was going. Evan noticed the pattern only after it had established itself: late evenings, quiet departures, returns that felt less tethered to the shared rhythm of the apartment. When Evan asked, Daniel answered honestly but vaguely, as if specificity no longer applied. "I just needed to step out," he would say. And Evan understood that what Daniel meant was not space. It was sequence. The apartment began favoring Daniel in small, undeniable ways. The hallway light responded to his presence. The silence settled when he entered a room, as if aligning itself around him. When Evan stood alone in the same spaces, the air felt unfinished, like something waiting for correction. The key appeared one final time. Evan found it in the pocket of a coat he rarely wore, heavy and unmistakable against his ribs. He did not remember placing it there. He did not wonder how it had arrived. By then, the key no longer felt like an intrusion. It felt like an offer. He stood in the hallway for a long time that night, turning it over in his hand, aware that using it no longer meant opening a door. The door had already done its work. What remained was acknowledgement. Daniel watched from the living room, expression calm, unreadable. "You don't have to," he said quietly. The statement was not reassurance. It was fact. Evan realized then that the structure had completed its evaluation. The apartment was no longer waiting to see what they would choose. It was waiting to see who would. The decision was not about staying or leaving. It was about alignment. And Evan understood, with a clarity that carried no anger and no relief, that the space no longer required him to remain. The sealed truth had shifted gravity. And gravity, once corrected, does not argue. It simply settles. Evan did not pack immediately. He waited through a full day and a full night, allowing the apartment to finish whatever quiet recalibration it was performing. Nothing urged him to hurry. Nothing resisted his presence either. The space had already decided what it needed. Time, now, was courtesy rather than pressure. By morning, the sealed room was gone. Not closed. Not hidden. Simply absent. The hallway wall had returned to its uninterrupted state, smooth and neutral, as if it had never learned to open. Evan stood there for a long moment, searching for residue, for a seam, a draft, a hint of the door's outline. There was nothing. The apartment had completed its record-keeping. Daniel noticed Evan's suitcase only when it was set by the door. He did not react with surprise. He did not ask questions meant to delay the moment. He only nodded once, a small acknowledgement that carried neither relief nor regret. "This makes sense," he said. Evan understood that this was not dismissal. It was accuracy. They spoke quietly after that, careful not to circle back toward justification. There were no apologies that would have required revision later, no promises that would need to be tested against the structure of what had already occurred. They discussed practicalities, mail forwarding, utilities, the timeline for the lease. The conversation remained intact because it did not attempt to repair anything. When Evan crossed the threshold for the last time, the apartment felt lighter. Not emptier. Aligned. The hallway light switched off behind him without sound. Somewhere inside, a balance settled that did not require witnesses. The key was gone. Weeks passed. Evan moved into a temporary place near the river, a smaller apartment that made no effort to remember him. The nights were quieter there, uncomplicated by attention. He slept more deeply than he had in months. The dreams faded first. Then the sense of pressure. Then the habit of reaching for something he no longer carried. Daniel did not contact him. Evan did not expect him to. Life resumed its ordinary pace, but something had shifted beneath it, an understanding that some spaces are not left behind because they are unpleasant, but because they have finished their work. One evening, months later, Evan stood in a grocery store parking lot, searching his coat pocket for his keys. For a brief, disorienting moment, his fingers closed around something heavier than expected. A key-shaped weight. A familiar pressure. His breath caught. Then his hand emerged holding only his car key, mundane and unremarkable. The sensation faded as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind not fear, but clarity. Some keys do not travel with you. They remain where truth was sealed. As proof that forgetting is not the same as escaping. And that alignment, once enforced, does not reverse itself. Evan started the car and drove away without looking back. Whatever had been closed did not need reopening. It only needed to be acknowledged. And relinquished.